On a freezing Tuesday morning in February, Giselle Harmon signed a contract, smirking openly at what she saw as a liability. $1,000. That was the cheap value she assigned. To a decaying warehouse she openly dismissed as a worthless scrap heap, not worth clearing. But the man standing across from her wore a faded work jacket, sporting grease-stained hands that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully clean. He did not argue, he did not flinch. He just took the keys, nodded quietly, and walked into the freezing gray air. Giselle laughed with her team, mocking the useless liability she had just dumped. Yet 6 months later, Caleb Merritt's name was headlining the major local business news. And Giselle Harmon, the executive who signed that paperwork, stood outside a massive building that used to belong to her, staring at a thriving empire she had mistakenly sold off. Listen closely, because what happened inside that shop changes everything we know about true wealth, where it hides, and the massive price of being too blind to see potential staring you in the face. Caleb Merritt grew up in a home thick with motor oil and strong coffee. His father, Raymond Merritt, opened a small Detroit garage in 1987, running it for 22 years until his physical health forced him to put down his tools. Caleb spent every single Saturday of his childhood inside that shop, not playing or watching television, but learning a trade. Learning to read an engine the way a doctor monitors a heartbeat. Learning to spot stress fractures in steel like an engineer reading blueprints. Learning to look past rust and peeling paint to find the sleeping machine underneath. By age 17, he could diagnose a broken engine just by listening to it. By 19, he was rebuilding massive transmissions by hand. By 22, he earned an engineering degree in automotive systems from college. He graduated near the top of his class and joined Vantage Auto Holdings, a specialized firm known for its high-end vintage restoration division. The precise work demanded both deep theory and raw practical instinct. Caleb had both in spades, dedicating 7 years of hard work to them. He wasn't the loudest voice in meetings, but always the most accurate. Coworkers trusted his skills and management relied on his data. He became the absolute expert at rescuing machines everyone else had written off. But large corporations rarely reward the critical people they rely on. 8 months before our story truly begins, Vantage finalized a corporate merger. The new corporate buyer saw his specialty as a useless liability. It lacked fast returns, failing to fit their narrow profit models. It simply did not look good on slides. 14 skilled specialists lost their jobs that Friday night. Their cold layoffs delivered via email at 11:17 p.m. Caleb read his alone in a tiny rented flat packed with spare parts. He did not reply, just staring into the dark before finally going to sleep. But the next morning, he began planning his empire. He spent 8 months grinding, repairing junk cars at a local impound, living on pennies, saving every cent to construct his ultimate vision. He did not waste precious energy on bitterness or noise. He searched for opportunity, exactly how his father taught him to analyze broken engines. Methodically, quietly, never expecting the opportunity to announce itself. At 31, his only debt was a tiny credit balance, and he had $18,000 in savings. Not enough for a massive shop, but plenty to build an empire if the right spark appeared. Giselle Harmon had never fixed a single thing with her hands. And she would have admitted that to you with zero apology. Her intelligence was different, strictly financial, highly territorial, and utterly relentless. At 38, she ran Harmon Capital Group. She inherited the real estate firm at 29 and aggressively grew it over the next decade. Company revenue had more than doubled. Her empire shifted from residential flips straight into commercial development. Then she targeted industrial redevelopment, snapping up old manufacturing land cheap. She rezoned the plots and sold them to developers for a massive premium. Her entire business relied on recognizing land value before anyone else did, which made the looming irony of this deal incredibly sharp. Giselle was famous for being direct to the point of absolute cruelty. She routinely cut meetings short the moment she felt they wasted her time. Anything she did not immediately understand was dismissed as completely beneath her. Her local peers often called her a visionary, while those negotiating against her simply called her a ruthless bulldozer. Both of those descriptions were accurate. But she was not cruel in the way sadistic people are cruel. She was just indifferent, a cold trait that is far more difficult to negotiate with. Her indifference did not bend to logic the way malice occasionally does. To her, the facts on the ground simply did not register at all. That January, her firm bought a 4-acre parcel of old industrial land on the city's northeast edge. It was an old light manufacturing site that had sat abandoned for over 10 years. Her strategy was straightforward. Hold the land, force through a mixed commercial rezoning, and cash in. Then she would flip the entire property to a major developer within 2 years. The deal looked perfect on paper, but a physical complication remained on the lot. Tucked into the back corner of the site sat a ruined garage structure. It was 900 square feet of rusted tin and crumbling walls from the 1960s. It featured broken shelves and a heavy roll-up door that had been jammed shut for 3 years. Her lead technician inspected the wiring and described the electrical grid in one word: dead. Her team calculated the demolition cost. Tearing it down would cost $12,000 to $15,000. Giselle had absolutely zero interest in wasting cash on a building she saw as a pure liability. When her staff suggested selling off the junk structure, she had a brief internal debate. She approved the sale faster than she could pour her morning cup of coffee. List it, dump the liability, move on. Owen Parker heard about the unwanted garage from a truck driver hauling scrap nearby. He had worked with Caleb for 3 years, and they stayed close even after the factory layoffs. Owen was freelancing now, welding, fabricating, and fixing engines. The moment he heard the whisper about the junk lot, he called Caleb, acting on pure instinct. He laid out the facts. A ruined garage. Harmon Capital saw a liability and wanted to dump it cheap. Caleb listened quietly, his mind already plotting. At dawn, he drove to the rundown lot and watched it from across the street. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees as light snow drifted sideways in the wind. Sitting frozen in his car, he studied the structure for 15 minutes without moving. On the outside, it was a total eyesore. The roll-up door was completely warped. 2 of the 4 small side windows were crudely boarded up with plywood. The roofline dipped with a heavy visible sag near the eastern corner. But Caleb was looking past the decay to see something else. He was measuring the footprint, mapping out a sturdy concrete foundation, analyzing the building's placement on the lot and, most importantly, locking in the address. He knew this exact intersection. He had driven past it dozens of times. He knew every surrounding property and what lay right next door. And he held a quiet, highly precise suspicion about the massive development coming to this area in 12 to 18 months. He dialed the number on the weathered sign staked at the gate. A Harmon Capital assistant picked up, and he requested an official viewing. They scheduled the walkthrough for the following week. Giselle showed up with 3 people: her assistant Adrienne Cole, a hired structural engineer, and her real estate attorney. She was wearing a luxury caramel wool coat and designer boots. She wore the smug expression of an executive who saw this whole meeting as a useless formality. Caleb arrived alone. Wearing his regular work jacket and holding a small notepad, he arrived 2 minutes early. As Giselle's luxury sedan pulled in, she stepped out. She glanced around the eyesore briefly. Then she sized up Caleb, a 3-second look that judged him entirely by his dusty work clothes. With a smirk that made her assistant grin, she asked if he was a mechanic or a scrap hauler. Caleb ignored the insult and kept his focus. He simply asked to see the interior. Giselle unlocked the side door. The massive roll-up was rusted shut and waved him inside, her entourage trailing behind. She instantly began listing the flaws, acting like a real estate agent pitch in reverse. The main door had been rusted shut for 3 years. She pointed out 3 structural cracks splitting the ceiling joists. The electrical wiring was completely dead. An official assessment showed the foundation was sinking in the northwest corner. She stated that with demo costs, the property was worth negative $15,000. She laid out the harsh figures without hesitation. She wanted to ensure he knew this was no deal, just a massive money pit. To her, she was selling a major headache with a price tag designed to make it disappear. Caleb nodded quietly, stepping deeper into the dark space. Switched on his phone light to cut through the heavy shadows. He examined every inch, running his hands along the solid concrete walls, seeing bones for an empire. He studied the overhead supports and crouched to inspect the concrete floor slab. After 12 minutes, he walked back out into the freezing air and asked a single question. "How much?" Giselle stared at him, seeing only a broke fool. She turned to her partner, repeating the question so everyone could hear. As if his offer was a total joke, $1,000. She demanded a total waiver of liability and a strict relocation clause, giving him 18 months to clear out before their redevelopment plans were approved and they broke ground. Caleb accepted immediately without arguing. He eagerly signed the contract on a cheap folding table set up near the gate. The bitter wind swept the lot as their corporate lawyer watched him closely. Once the handshake was complete and the keys were in his pocket, Giselle muttered to Adrian, loud enough so everyone knew she had just dumped a worthless liability onto a very foolish man. Her team snickered, walking back to their luxury vehicles. Caleb stood alone, looking at his new kingdom. He slowly paced the entire perimeter of his future empire, studying the old walls before driving away. He paused at the side door for exactly 2 seconds, peering through a dark crack in the warped frame at something hidden in the corner. A massive shape under a heavy blue tarp that towered to the ceiling. Then he quietly walked to his car and drove away. He returned the very next morning at 6. He brought a heavy flashlight, a steel pry bar, hand tools, and a blank notebook. He ignored the decaying walls and went straight for the tarps. 8 massive covers were waiting for him in the dark. They were wrapped tightly in old ropes and buried under decades of heavy dust in this forgotten, sealed-off tomb. Gently he pulled the first dusty cover away, moving with the caution of a man who knew he was holding a fortune. Beneath it rested a classic car. He pulled the next, another one. He uncovered all 8 of them in under 30 minutes. Each was a stunning revelation. 8 legendary vehicles sitting in 2 rows. An incredible fortune abandoned in a wreck that the corporate suits deemed completely worthless. They saw a useless liability slated for demolition, too blind to ever look past those dirty tarps at the massive empire waiting beneath. He stood in the center of his new empire, flashlight sweeping over the dusty steel as he silently grinned. He wiped decades of dust from the badge of the first car, a 1967 Ford Mustang. The steel had some surface rust on the panels. The original paint was peeling, but the bright chrome was flawless. The glass remained flawless. He opened the door, checked the odometer, and confirmed the machine had slept there for decades. The vehicle identification numbers were completely original. Popping the hood, he discovered a legendary V8 engine sitting there with absolutely zero damage. He noted the mileage in his book and shut it gently. But the second vehicle made his heart beat even faster. A 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. A legendary model so rare that wealthy collectors would pay a massive fortune for an example in much worse condition. The factory markings were clear, and the classic trim was perfect. He noted the value and drew a tight circle around it. Vehicles 3 through 5 were sedans from the 1950s and early 60s. A 58 Chevrolet Bel Air, a 61 Ford Galaxy, and a 63 Buick Riviera, all salvageable. Each would bring serious cash once restored, though not like the first 2 gems. The 6th car stopped him completely. He crouched down, studying the emblem from a precise angle to ensure he was reading the name correctly. A 1971 De Tomaso Pantera, an Italian-American sports car built in limited numbers through a partnership between the Italian coach builder and Ford's engine division. Total production across all years was only 10,000 units. Finding one in any condition was highly unusual. But finding one in a forgotten northeastern garage, with its chassis present and its mid-engine bay sealed, was the kind of miracle that only happens in legends. Except this was not a story yet. Right now it was just a freezing building pierced by a single flashlight beam. And a man in a worn work jacket, plotting his future with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. The last 2 cars were far too gone. Their floors had collapsed and panels rusted, but they still held valuable parts. And those parts meant cash. He jotted down a rough initial estimate, sitting on a plastic milk crate inside the garage with his notebook. Restored properly, those cars represented $400,000 to $600,000 in real market value. She sold him the liability for just $1,000, everything included. That afternoon, he scouted the surrounding neighborhood blocks. He knew these streets intimately, not from municipal maps, but from a lifetime of living and walking the area. The property sat on a prime corner lot where two secondary roads crossed. It was barely a quarter-mile from a federal highway on-ramp, and sat directly next to a major bus corridor, which the City Transit Authority had been quietly planning to expand for 18 months. 3 empty lots sat directly behind his garage, facing the side street. They were selling for cheap, priced only for their run-down appearance. Overgrown, abandoned, and hidden behind rusty chain link. No one else had connected those pieces to the coming infrastructure map. Caleb reached out to an old contact from his engineering days, a municipal planner named Marcus, that very evening. He asked a simple, casual question about the future development zones for that specific area. Marcus gave him a straightforward, casual answer. The block was officially designated as a Phase 2 commercial development zone in their private files, meaning that in 12 to 18 months, massive infrastructure upgrades would be announced, and local land values would skyrocket overnight. Caleb hung up, sat down at his kitchen table, and breathed. He stared at his notebook's figures and smiled. It was his first genuine smile since the devastating night he was let go. He dialed Owen the following morning, keeping the massive details to himself. He told him only that he had found an opportunity with no immediate salary, but he truly believed it was worth every second of their time. Owen asked what the property cost. Caleb replied $1,000. A quiet pause stretched. Owen asked him to say the number again. Caleb repeated it. After another silence, Owen promised he would be there by 8 o'clock. When Owen stepped inside and saw those 8 half-hidden machines, he stood frozen for a long, silent moment. His eyes drifted from the Camaro to the Mustang, and finally to the Pantera. Turning toward Caleb, he whispered quietly that he needed to take a seat. Caleb decided they would tackle the Mustang first. Owen shed his jacket and asked for the tools. Those first 2 months brought the grueling, unglamorous labor that never looks good in photos or stories. The routine was brutal, freezing, repetitive, and deeply exhausting. To save on rent, Caleb camped out right inside the cold workshop for 3 weeks, setting up his thin cot by the south wall, sheltering from the bitter wind. Most days they labored from before dawn until long after sunset. The Mustang needed a whole new crankshaft. It was a rare component they had to track down from an Ohio contact. That 3-week delay forced them to pivot, prepping the Camaro and the Bel Air instead. Tearing down, degreasing, labeling, and figuring out what could be saved versus what was junk. Caleb spent his personal savings very cautiously. $18,000 looked like plenty, but custom replacement parts ate it up. Specialty oils, body filler compounds, and fresh electrical wiring. Plus the endless metal sheets and welding supplies Owen burned through, the bank account only moved down. After just 1 month, only $1,200 remained. He kept that secret from Owen. He picked up 2 graveyard towing shifts through a local contact. Working the impound lot got him enough cash for more gear, and he kept quiet about it. During a freezing rainstorm in mid-February, a piece of the eastern roof gave way. It was not a total collapse, but freezing water drenched the Camaro's exposed engine bay. They had completely stripped it down for cleaning. Owen slammed his fist onto the metal bench, roaring a string of bitter curses. Caleb just stared quietly at the rain collecting inside the open cylinder cavities. He grabbed a pair of heavy tarps and threw them over the bare metal. He quietly wiped up the water with greasy rags, then returned to his work. Owen watched him in silence for a moment, then grabbed his wrench and got back to it. It happened right around the heel, 3rd week of February. Caleb sat entirely alone in the freezing workshop and pulled out an old pocket notebook. It was not the spiral pad tracking the rebuilds. This was a worn, water-stained booklet that had once belonged to his late dad. Raymond Merritt had filled those pages over 30 years of turning wrenches on old cars. Scattered details, specs, and thoughts. Simple wisdom that had built up slowly, much like grease building in the threads of an old bolt. Right in the middle, written in his father's bold, blocky handwriting, was a single note: "When they see rust, you see the metal underneath." Caleb had stared at those exact words easily 100 times before. To a young boy, it just sounded like some old garage proverb. But after 7 years inside a corporate high-rise, it felt like the most brilliantly accurate business advice ever put to paper. Caleb clicked his pen and added his own line right beneath it. $1,000 February. This is where it begins. He snapped the book shut and tucked it deep inside his jacket, keeping it close for the rest of the long journey. By late March, the legendary fastback was finally complete. No cheap modifications, no flashy paint to mask the metal. You and I know that elite collectors only buy flawless, factory-spec restorations. The team stripped every body panel, primed them, and sprayed the exact factory shade of Highland green. They replated the worn chrome and carefully preserved every salvageable original piece. They sourced period-correct components to match the vehicle's original identification. The carburetor was rebuilt, the cooling system sealed, and the cabin wrapped in fresh black vinyl. On a quiet Saturday morning, Owen rolled their creation out as the sun cleared the rooftops. He slipped into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine caught on the second crank. It quickly settled into a deep, steady rumble that commanded absolute respect. Caleb watched from the edge of the open garage door. He stood with folded arms, listening to the idle, remembering the freezing January days they spent repairing that garage door. Owen revved the engine once gently. The deep exhaust note carried a raw power that no spec sheet could ever truly measure. Caleb simply nodded, said it sounded good, and walked back inside. He bypassed the public and listed the asset on an exclusive forum for elite collectors. No noisy auctions or public markets, just a highly strategic professional pitch. It featured the car's documented pedigree, step-by-step rebuild photos, and his direct line. Within 72 hours, he received 11 high-value inquiries. But he focused on one serious buyer, a woman named Diana Ashford. She was a 55-year-old widow who had inherited a massive industrial estate from her late husband. He was a titan who built his empire in heavy manufacturing. Together, they spent a decade curating one of the most prestigious collections of classic American steel in the entire country. All of it was secured in a climate-controlled compound in Vermont. She did not bicker over price. Instead, she demanded hard data about the VIN and original build sheet. She scrutinized every supplier used for the high-end chrome restoration. She wanted the engine rebuild paperwork. You and I see two master tacticians at work as Caleb answered her with absolute precision. She scheduled an in-person inspection, bringing along her personal top-tier mechanical engineer, a veteran Chrysler inspector named George. George wore a flat cap and kept quiet, but spent 2 hours inspecting the undercarriage. He scanned the engine bay using a precision borescope and detailed reference logs. Finally, the engineer quietly delivered his professional assessment to his boss. It was the most authentic, museum-grade restoration he had ever witnessed in the field. Diana offered $94,000. Caleb shook her hand, and the wire cleared 3 days later. Owen spotted the massive bank notification and grabbed Caleb in pure celebration. Caleb tolerated the hug for 2 seconds, stepped back, and gave a single nod. Then he walked back to his workbench to continue building his next high-value project. But before Diana left, she said something that changed everything. It became the blueprint for everything they built next. As she pulled on her leather driving gloves, she gave Caleb a strategic tip. She explained that her wealthy network of collectors was actively hunting for elite, top-tier automotive work. She said, "If you find another worthy project, call me directly before listing it publicly." He thanked her warmly, keeping his real plans entirely to himself. She had no idea he already had 6 more classic cars waiting inside that worthless building. At least 2 that she would have gladly bought for herself. Within 2 weeks of selling the Mustang, Diana shared Caleb's contact details with 2 wealthy collectors in her circle. Both called immediately. Within the month, he sold a beautifully restored 1958 Bel Air, painted in its factory-correct white two-tone, for $28,500. With just those 2 sales, he cleared $122,500 on a mere $19,000 investment. He immediately reinvested in the land. He reached out to the owners of the empty lots behind his shop, skipping the brokers and formal real estate listings entirely. He bought both in a private deal for $67,000. The sellers had no idea about the massive zoning changes coming, so they were happy with the price. Caleb filed the paperwork and registered his new automotive business. He also locked down a third lot with an option to buy within 60 days. Next, he hired 2 more experts, including a body specialist named Kevin. Kevin had spent years at a top restoration shop in Pennsylvania. He also brought on a parts expert named Ray. Ray had 15 years of experience hunting down hard to find vintage parts. Owen naturally stepped up as the unofficial technical director of the entire operation. They officially registered the business as Merritt Restoration and Auto Works. Rebuilding the De Tomaso Pantera took 6 weeks and pushed their skills to the limit. The powerful Ford Cleveland V8 engine sat buried inside the Italian frame. It was completely seized up from years of sitting idle. Unlocking it without cracking the block required an 11-day chemical bath. It took a level of patience that Owen called borderline spiritual. Getting the right body panels meant importing them directly from Europe. They dealt with an Italian craftsman near Bologna who only communicated through an old fax machine. The cabin restoration demanded rare vinyl and carpet from 2 completely different vendors. One based in Germany, the other in New Jersey. Every single wheel had to be rebuilt from scratch. The electrical system was, in Owen's view, a total nightmare designed by Italian engineers to torture anyone trying to fix it. But when the finished classic car finally sat gleaming under the shop lights, its rich crimson paint holding a deep shine that seemed to capture the entire room, that aggressive wedge profile, looked just as striking as the day it debuted in 1971, proving that it was hands down the most beautiful machine any of them had ever built. For 9 years, reporter Charlotte Webb had covered local business and finance stories. She possessed a real knack for spotting massive success stories long before the mainstream media ever noticed them. Word of Caleb's growing auto restoration empire reached her through a local classic car collector. When she called him in June, Caleb politely declined, saying he wanted no publicity. Undeterred, she emailed him the very next morning. The journalist didn't offer him a flattering, sugar-coated profile. Her email made it clear she didn't care about easy victories. She wanted to understand the moment someone saw raw potential. Where others only saw liability, you and I know he chose to build instead. He studied the message twice, waited a day, then offered 30 minutes. They met inside his shop, which was now a highly organized, active operation, nothing like the rotting shell he first unlocked in February. They talked for 2.5 hours. She asked about the cars and the tarps. She probed about that freezing winter morning, the key and the deal. She wanted to know who practically gave it away. He answered with absolute quiet calm. He explained that Harmon Capital sold it, and their elite CEO personally signed the deed. The reporter noted that detail and underlined it. The prestigious Barrett-Jackson consignment event took place on the last Saturday of June inside a massive downtown conference hall. He entered the rare Pantera back in January, long before completing it. Supported entirely by the vehicle's history and his master restoration plan, they accepted his machine as one of 10 prime evening features. He arrived in a sharp dark suit, the first he had worn since his father's funeral 5 years ago. Owen sat in the crane, second row, arms crossed and jaw clenched tight, wearing that familiar stubborn look he used when hiding his deep anxiety. Diana Ashford herself was in attendance. She had tracked the listing through her high society network, arriving with 2 wealthy collectors from her circle. She and Caleb locked eyes. Across the crowded gallery, she offered a cold, slight nod of recognition. The gorgeous Pantera was the 8th car up. As it rolled under the bright stage lights, the transformation was undeniable. The entire room went dead silent, not clapping just yet. Just a sharp, collective gasp at the sheer undeniable masterpiece he had built. The speaker detailed its rare history and the absolute perfection of its rebuild. And when he announced Caleb and his brand new restoration empire as the creators, a large portion of the crowd who knew his story, from the article published just 4 days ago, burst into a roaring applause that felt far deeper than normal polite clapping. Bidding started at $80,000. It quickly reached $100,000, jumped to $130,000, then climbed to $168,000. A bidder in the crowd countered at $172,000. The phone bidder fired back instantly. The room fell silent, that heavy quiet we feel when a dream turns into real, massive fortune. sold at $178,000. Owen let out a breath so loud his neighbor spun around. Caleb sat in complete silence for a brief moment, then rose gracefully to accept a congratulatory handshake. He was calm with the supreme confidence of someone who had slaved all winter in a freezing shop, quietly building his vision until it finally became reality. He was not shocked, he was vindicated. Giselle Harmon was at the showcase. She had not come for the bidding itself. She was there only because her lawyer insisted. After the news story broke, she needed to witness the full scale of what she had lost before making her move. She watched from the back of the room as the bidding began. She watched the price skyrocket and the auction hammer slam down. She watched Caleb accept the crowd's congratulations with his usual quiet dignity. Once the auction ended and the crowd thinned out, she walked across the floor toward him. Approaching him took every ounce of pride she had left. Not quite regret, since Giselle was not made for regret, but something very close to it. It meant fighting the defensive instincts she had relied on for so long. Spinning a self-protective lie ever since Adrian had placed that article on her desk. Charlotte Webb spotted her crossing the room and immediately pulled out her notebook. Giselle stopped right in front of Caleb, completely on her own. No assistants, no lawyers, and no engineers, just her. She wore a different coat than the one from that day in February. Standing in front of a man whose name now filled 2 major business journals, and who had just watched his work sell for over $178,000 in one night. She admitted that she had misjudged the entire situation. She did not explain further, offering no excuses or details. From someone else in another situation, the apology might have seemed weak, but from Giselle Harmon, who had built her whole career on the idea that her judgment was always superior, this brief confession was, in its own way, entirely complete. Caleb stared at her in silence, refusing to bring up what had happened back in February. He did not repeat her old insults back to her. He chose not to indulge in the easy victory he had clearly earned. Instead, he spoke in a calm voice. She had only seen a liability from the outside and made a business decision based on that. But he had made a different choice, seeing the potential empire waiting underneath the dust. They had just looked at the exact same asset with very different equipment. Then he offered his hand, and she shook it. He turned and walked back to where Owen was standing, saying something quietly as they both looked at the empty floor where the Pantera had been displayed. And then they immediately started planning the Camaro build. By late June, the full financial success of Merritt Restoration and Auto Works was undeniable. Total revenue generated from car sales at the Barrett-Jackson auction hit $398,000. The 3 expansion lots he bought right behind his garage had, following May's official announcement of the Phase 2 infrastructure program, been valued at $520,000. That was roughly triple what Caleb had paid for them. Active rebuild contracts, including a project from Diana Ashford, who wanted Caleb's crew to restore a rare car she found, plus 2 more client referrals, brought in $145,000 in secured deals. The entire value of his growing empire, including all gear and land, active contracts, and the next 2 classic cars awaiting their turn. Its value easily topped $1 million. Owen Parker accepted a formal 20% stake in the growing company immediately, without needing a long discussion. Caleb officially submitted a building permit application for a permanent structure on his newly consolidated lot. A professional multi-bay workshop complete with a dedicated paint booth, a climate-controlled storage bay, and a modern office wing. He christened his rising empire's first physical headquarters, Merritt Auto Works Building 1. One Thursday evening in July, after his crew left, he returned to the quiet shop alone, not to work but just to stand inside it. The leaking roof had been completely replaced in April. The cracked concrete floor was thoroughly cleaned, patched, and sealed. A fresh motor ran the roll-up door, and the entire electrical grid was brand new. The workspace was orderly, brightly lit, functional, and for the first time in decades, pulsing with life. Caleb slowly walked to the eastern corner, the exact spot where he had pressed his palm against the concrete on his first morning inside. The morning of the plastic tarps, the flashlight, and his notebook. That section of wall had not been repainted. The original concrete block, stained with old rust and darkened by decades of neglect, was still exactly as it had been when he first touched it. He had specifically instructed Kevin to leave that one area untouched during the massive renovation. Kevin had asked him why. Caleb simply replied that it was the most vital part of the structure and had to remain exactly as it was. He stood quietly before it for several minutes, letting his busy mind drift completely blank, just grounding himself in the exact spot his empire began. Then he switched off the bay lights, locked the roll-up door, and walked to his truck. As his story spread and a massive audience eventually heard it, people wondered. When Charlotte Webb's second article hit 3 major national publications, they constantly asked Caleb for his core lesson. He offered different answers depending on the moment, and depending heavily on what the person before him needed to hear. To fellow blue-collar tradespeople, he warned that qualifications and corporate loyalty won't protect you. So build the empire that you can raise with your own hands. To the younger generation, he explained that being underestimated is not the same as being wrong. To reporters, he shared very little, having learned from Charlotte that the more details he gave them, the more their own narratives would crowd into the quiet spaces he left. He preferred for his journey to mean exactly what it was, rather than being distorted for a sensational headline. Yet the shortest answer he ever shared, the one most printed by the media, remained absolutely unchanged. Look much closer before you write things off. But in private, inside the worn notebook kept in his jacket pocket, he penned a much longer entry below his father's faded script and his own notes from February. He wrote that Giselle saw only the raw cost of things and called it value, and that he had tried to see the true potential of things, letting the costs figure themselves out. She had stared at the rust and seen a massive liability, while he had gazed at that same rust, knowing an empire was waiting to be built. He concluded that neither of them had been acting foolishly. They had simply been trained to search for different things. And in that single exchange on one freezing winter morning, that single shift in perspective was worth exactly $1,000 to her, but to him, it meant the foundation of an entire empire. He snapped his notebook shut. Outside his new office window, a small corner he had carved out of the garage with a second-hand desk and a decent chair, the bright lights of Merritt Auto Works were still shining. Owen had left an air compressor running in the back bay, humming right through the wall. Caleb listened to the slow, steady pulse of it. It was the sound of a business breathing, of an empire coming alive. A business built from a single bold decision, made in the freezing cold with a key in his jacket. A pocket, a telephone number scribbled in a notebook, and a unique way of looking at the world. He saw hidden potential in things that everyone else had dismissed as utterly worthless. The Pantera that sold for $178,000. It spent 40 years rotting under a blue tarp in a building valued at -$15,000. The garage housing it was sold for $1,000 by a CEO who saw only a useless liability. But Caleb Merritt paid that $1,000 because he saw an empire waiting to be built, and in the very end, what he understood had nothing to do with the cars, the land, or even the official contracts, the fancy auctions, the news articles, or the handshake. It was the massive difference between what something looks like and what it truly is. That difference was forged in sweat, certainty, and 6 months of brutal labor from sunrise to past midnight. It proved to be worth far more than $1,000. In the end, it was worth everything.